The tariffs. The word tariff to me is the most beautiful word in the entire dictionary. We're going to tariff the hell out of them.
I am a tariff man.
On all goods coming into the United States from Canada.
The Trump economy is sputtering. We learned this morning that job growth in the past 3 months has all but ended.
Investment has stalled, and Americans are going to lose their jobs. It's not Liberation Day. It was called Termination Day because Americans will be terminated.
We're going to make sure that we inflict as much pain as possible to the American people.
The news just dropped, and it's wild Washington's tariffs on Canada have completely backfired. This was supposed to be a clean strike, squeeze Canada, save American factories, win fast. But the second those tariffs hit, everything went sideways. Costs exploded, production ground to a halt, and U.S. jobs started disappearing in places where the damage was never supposed to land. This is the story of how a trade war aimed at Canada boomeranged back and started ripping through America's own economy.
Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly says the relationship between the United States and Canada will never be the same again.
Announced corporate job cuts, Andrew, in the U.S. surging past 1 million so far this year, with 153,000 new layoffs announced just in October, according to Challenger.
In early 2025, tariffs were rolled out with confidence, sold as a decisive strike to pressure Canada and revive American factories. The promise was simple: impose the costs, force compliance, and win. But Canada hit back hard, and that's when U.S. jobs started disappearing. Since April, when the tariffs were imposed, the U.S. manufacturing sector has shed 67,000 jobs. By November, that number had climbed to 59,000 manufacturing jobs lost, with factory hiring plunging to its weakest rate since 2016.
The tariffs, they're all set.
Canada's plan to hit back.
This is an existential threat to us.
The world's perception of Canadians is that we are nice, but we also don't let ourselves be steamrolled.
Taking effect today, Canada's new 25% tariffs on more than $20 billion worth of U.S. goods.
On paper, the plan looked controlled. Heavy tariffs hit Canadian goods, energy was targeted, and exemptions were reserved for companies that could thread impossible rules. Washington sold it as clean and orderly. Then Canada crushed back with its own tariffs, swift, surgical, and devastating.
I'm in full support of preparing retaliatory tariffs, tariff for tariff.
Canada announced 25% retaliatory tariffs on $155 billion worth of American exports in 2 phases. The first wave hit $30 billion of U.S. goods on March 4th, targeting bourbon, orange juice, steel, and aluminum. By March 13th, another $30 billion in products were hit, turning Washington's measured plan into an all-out economic knife fight neither side could afford to lose.
Even more of a negative downward pressure on U.S. economic growth.
Experts are warning this could eventually impact our wallets.
Yeah, this could directly impact our wallet.
President Trump's tariffs are one of the most harmful and unnecessary mistakes of the modern era.
They rip us off. It's so sad to see.
Almost everything Donald Trump has said about the history, economics, and technicalities of trade is delusional.
Supply chains don't stop for speeches. They're locked months ahead. Contracts signed, production set, no off switch. When the tariffs hit, costs didn't rise slowly. They spiked all at once. Then Canada crushed back, and U.S. jobs started disappearing. Ottawa slammed American exports with surgical retaliation, turning Washington's clean strike into an all-out brawl neither side could win.
Now doubling his punch on steel and aluminum tariffs.
We're going to bring it from 25% to 50%, the tariffs on steel into the United States of America.
And rising costs drive belt tightening and hiring freezes. Announced layoffs don't always lead to actual cuts and could take place from attrition.
Then the pressure intensified. By summer, tariff rates climbed even higher, and the fight narrowed onto steel and aluminum, the foundational materials behind everything from vehicles to machinery to construction. These were not niche products that could be swapped out easily. They were embedded deep inside the American industrial system, and the price shock rippled outward faster than anyone had planned for.
They would pay more for production costs to build cars, home appliances, furniture, and tools. Already the price of steel in the U.S. is substantially higher than in other major manufacturing nations.
At first, nothing appeared broken. Factories stayed open. Trucks kept rolling. There were no emergency press conferences. But beneath the surface, margins tightened, purchase orders were delayed, and production math began to fail. Executives didn't panic publicly. They recalculated privately. And that was the critical miscalculation.
Yeah, Sarah and Brian, a new poll reveals the cost of groceries is a, quote, major source of stress for about half of Americans already. And with new tariffs set to go into effect this week, the price of staples and all kinds of other items will go up even further.
Washington had treated tariffs like a border weapon, assuming the damage would stop at the line between two countries. But modern manufacturing doesn't recognize borders the way politics does. The tariffs crossed back into the United States, hidden inside invoices, buried in cost structures, and quietly absorbed by American factories that had no easy way out.
The impacts are wide-ranging. The sticker price on big-ticket items like furniture, appliances, electronics, and cars could go up immediately. Prices on alcohol could spike next month.
Nothing collapsed overnight. Instead, something more dangerous began to take shape. A slow, silent squeeze that would only reveal its consequences months later. And by the time those consequences surfaced, the damage was already locked in.
We know that this is an existential threat to us, and there are thousands of jobs in Canada at stake.
The federal government had a multi-phase plan for counter-tariffs ready the last time Trump leveled this threat. Melanie Joly says that pushed back.
While Washington was still defending tariffs as a show of strength, Canada was already calculating the damage and how to redirect it. Ottawa knew it couldn't win a trade war by matching volume for volume. The U.S. economy was simply larger. So Canada chose a different strategy: precision.
Canadians are reasonable, and we are polite, but we will not back down from a fight. Canada will be implementing 25% tariffs against $155 billion worth of American goods.
Within weeks, Canada rolled out 25% retaliatory tariffs on carefully selected U.S. goods. These were not broad consumer items meant to spark outrage at home. They were politically sensitive products tied to specific regions and industries inside the United States. The message wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. The pressure would be focused, not theatrical. Then Canada escalated in a way tariffs alone never could.
Bottles of Kentucky bourbon and Tennessee whiskey are whisked from BC store shelves days before the U.S. tariffs hit.
This means that we are going to be taking $80 million out of the U.S. economy.
In Ontario, the LCBO is scrubbing American products from its catalog. American distillers say bans in multiple provinces will affect more than $1 billion in cross-border booze trade.
Provincial governments began pulling American alcohol off store shelves entirely. For U.S. producers, this wasn't a theoretical threat. It was an immediate market shutdown. In just weeks, sales of U.S. spirits in Canada collapsed by more than 60%, according to industry data. And by the second quarter of 2025, U.S. spirits exports to Canada had fallen by roughly 85%, dropping to under 10 million hauser. One major U.S. distiller described the move bluntly: worse than a tariff. But the most consequential decision came later.
I'm announcing today that the Canadian government will now match the United States by removing all of Canada's tariffs on U.S. goods specifically covered under CUSMA. This decision will take effect.
On September 1st, 2025, Canada quietly lifted a large portion of its retaliatory tariffs. At first glance, it looked like a retreat. In reality, it was a recalibration. Ottawa removed tariffs that risked driving up prices for Canadian consumers, but it deliberately kept tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles, the very sectors tied most directly to American manufacturing jobs, union influence, and cross-border supply chains.
Hundreds of everyday household items are about to get a lot more expensive thanks to President Trump's trade war and specifically the steel and aluminum tariffs. The tariffs were initially only expected to hit raw materials, but now they include goods containing.
This wasn't accidental. Steel and aluminum entering the United States were already facing tariffs as high as 50%. And autos were dealing with cost pressures that analysts estimated could add over $100 billion in expenses across the North American auto industry in a single year. By keeping pressure on these sectors, Canada ensured the economic pain would stay concentrated where it mattered most politically.
Now, President Trump says these new tariffs are aimed at reshaping and winning on global trade, but Bell and Goldman say they don't see any winners right now.
To reinforce the move, Canada published detailed HS code lists of U.S. products still subject to retaliation. Nothing was hidden. The pressure points were documented, deliberate, and visible to every affected company. At first, the damage didn't show up where everyone was looking. There were no immediate factory closures, no dramatic collapse, no single headline screaming failure. That delay created a dangerous illusion that the tariffs were working. In reality, the system was absorbing the shock, quietly and unevenly.
Heating up, the Trump administration is quietly making it even more expensive to import hundreds of items that all of us would see on store shelves. So this is a major expansion of those 50% steel and aluminum tariffs. Previously, those tariffs shielded items that just simply contained steel and aluminum.
American manufacturers that depended on Canadian inputs suddenly faced higher bills they couldn't pass on overnight. Steel, aluminum, auto parts, energy components, these weren't optional materials. They were embedded deep inside production lines. Paying tariffs became unavoidable, and with rates on key metals climbing to crushing levels, costs didn't rise incrementally. They spiked. Companies responded the only way they could. Hiring plans were frozen, expansion projects were shelved, overtime disappeared, new equipment orders were delayed. These decisions rarely make headlines, but they always come before layoffs. By the time workers notice something is wrong, the math has already failed. Within months, the labor data began to catch up.
There were just 22,000 new jobs created last month, and new revised data showed the economy actually lost jobs in June, the first time that's happened since President Trump's first term, back when most of us were still in isolation during COVID.
U.S. manufacturing employment started shrinking and didn't stop. For 7 consecutive months, factories cut jobs instead of adding them. Since the tariffs took effect in April, roughly 67,000 manufacturing jobs disappeared, according to economists tracking the fallout. This wasn't a coincidence. It was the lagged effect of higher input costs working their way through the system.
We do have the data, and it is not good. 22,000 jobs created during the month of August. That is significantly lower than the 75,000 anticipated. Last month, 73,000 revised up to 79,000. Change in private payrolls.
The broader picture was even more troubling. When economists at Yale modeled the combined effect of 2025 tariffs and foreign retaliation, they estimated that U.S. payroll employment could end the year nearly 490,000 jobs lower than it would have been otherwise. That wasn't a forecast based on fear. It was arithmetic. Tariffs functioned like a tax on supply chains, and the labor market paid the price.
The first inflation report since the government shutdown ended last month is now out. Inflation rose by 2.7% in November year over year. There is no month-over-month figure because the October report was canceled due to the shutdown.
Compounding the problem, the warning signs were partially hidden. A 43-day government shutdown disrupted the collection of employment and inflation data, casting a fog over the true state of the economy. Economists cautioned that downturns in U.S. labor markets rarely unfold gently. When they turn, they tend to accelerate suddenly.
Financial pinch from these fees will also be felt at home. John Lawrence reports.
Consumers across the globe are given fair warning. Expect to see higher prices.
The damage didn't spread all at once. It crept. The first cracks showed up in autos, where the math broke fastest. Cars built in North America routinely cross the Canada-US border 6 to 8 times before completion, meaning tariffs stacked repeatedly at every stage. Combined with the broader metal tariff pressure, analysts warned costs could exceed $100 billion across North American auto production in a single year. Automakers responded the only way they could, cutting shifts, delaying investments, and quietly pulling back on hiring as vehicle prices climbed and demand softened.
Economic analysts say Americans are going to be picking up some of the tab from these worldwide tariffs.
The result of these tariffs is that the average American household is going to face price increases
of around $2,400 per family.
The National Retail Federation.
Construction was next, and it moved just as quietly. With metal tariffs crushing margins, project bids began coming in higher than expected. Developers paused, financing stalled. Industry groups warned projects were being postponed or scrapped altogether. No mass layoffs made headlines, but crews worked fewer hours. Subcontractors saw contracts dry up, and job creation slowed to a crawl.
Steep tariffs on cars imported into the United States are going into effect, and auto industry analysts say it's going to jack up prices. Cox Automotive chief economist Jonathan Smoke said the unthinkable has happened.
Then the pressure reached the system's nobody, associates with trade wars. Copper prices jumped as tariffs pushed costs higher across wiring, motors, transformers, power grids, and electric vehicle components. These materials sit at the core of factory upgrades and energy expansion. As costs rose, capital spending stalled. Projects that once promised future jobs were frozen before a single worker was hired.
A lot of people say that it's really difficult for the United States to make cheaper vehicles, so expect a lot of those cars to potentially be on the chopping block.
Logistics felt the whiplash soon after. Early on, companies rushed to move inventory ahead of higher tariffs, creating the illusion of strength. But once stockpiles filled, freight volumes dropped, trucking routes were cut, warehouses slowed intake, ports handled fewer repeat shipments. What began as a surge turned into instability, and instability kills jobs in transportation faster than any tariff ever could.
The National Retail Federation reports nearly 70% of back-to-school shoppers in the U.S. hit the stores early in an attempt to save money.
I'm definitely seeing an increase in the prices. We're trying to get ahead of time because we don't know what's going to happen.
By late summer, the damage hit consumers. Prices surged, confidence collapsed, retailers slashed hours. What started in factories had spread to storefronts. The bleeding was everywhere now. This was the most dangerous phase. The damage crept industry by industry. Autos, construction, energy, logistics, retail. Each absorbed the shock, spreading job losses across sectors, employing tens of millions of Americans. By the time the slowdown became impossible to ignore, the truth was brutal. The trade war hadn't failed. It had worked. Against the United States.
Is still ready to go.
We've done the work. We are ready should the U.S. decide to launch their trade war. We are ready with $155 billion worth of tariffs.
The imbalance in this trade war came down to position and leverage, and the numbers reveal why. At that moment, the trade war shifted. Canada had stripped out inflation risk at home while locking the fight onto U.S. industrial supply chains, sectors that employed millions and anchored entire regional economies. Canada sits inside supply chains that feed some of the largest U.S. industries. In 2024 alone, Canada supplied more than 50% of U.S. aluminum imports, over 20% of steel imports, and remained the largest foreign supplier of energy to the United States. When tariffs disrupted these flows, the impact moved straight into American production costs rather than stopping at the border.
A theme emerged as dozens of witnesses weighed in. Save CUSMA, or the USMCA, as it's known here in Washington.
It is the most consequential trade agreement on the planet.
Renew the USMCA. Get this done.
Trade rules amplified the effect. Under CUSMA, only goods meeting strict rules of origin qualified for tariff relief. Everything else faced penalties, rising to 35% or more. Compliance failures translated directly into higher landed costs. Companies absorbed those costs through lower margins, delayed hiring, and canceled investment. The battlefield shifted from customs checkpoints to corporate balance sheets.
The United States has laid out the conditions it expects Canada to meet during the review of their key free trade deal. Conditions the U.S. Trade Representative says must be met in order to keep CUSMA for the long term.
The contrast in outcomes sharpened. Canada reduced inflation exposure at home and kept retaliation focused on U.S. industrial pressure points. The United States absorbed higher costs across autos, construction, energy systems, logistics, and retail. Capital spending slowed as uncertainty widened. Modern manufacturing responds to incentives. Once suppliers reroute, contracts rewrite, tooling investments move, and timelines lock in. Reversing those decisions requires years of stability and lower costs. By the time the adjustment became visible, the pattern had already hardened across North America.
To go to war, to go to a trade war with the...
Ontario's premier seethed on U.S. cable TV about how he might push back, from cutting off critical mineral supplies to no longer buying U.S. alcohol and more.
This trade war stopped being a test of toughness and became a test of strategy. One economy narrowed the damage and controlled the pressure. The other carried rising costs across its own system, sector by sector, job by job. And that is why the fallout kept spreading.
We keep the lights on to 1.5 million homes and manufacturing in New York, in Michigan, and in Minnesota. If he wants to destroy our economy and our families, I will shut down the electricity.
As the numbers worsened, the messaging didn't change. Officials kept selling strength, while factories kept cutting back. The gap between rhetoric and reality widened. And once jobs started disappearing, credibility followed them out the door. Trade policy stopped sounding tough and started sounding disconnected. Tariffs were launched to force a win. Instead, they rewired supply chains, drained momentum, and erased jobs at home. And the most dangerous part was this: once the damage spread, there was no fast way back. If this is what a winning trade war looks like, who exactly is supposed to be winning?